The call came in at 3:47 on a Tuesday afternoon, and nothing in Detective Elena Marchetti's 15 years on the force had prepared her for what waited inside that crumbling Victorian farmhouse on Old Mill Road. She had investigated homicides, missing persons, and once a crime scene so disturbing that she couldn't eat spaghetti for 2 years. But the Vernon Dae was different. The Vernon Dae wasn't dead. He was merely forgotten, and in many ways, she would later reflect, that was far, far worse. The neighbors had reported a strange odor seeping through the boarded-up windows, the kind of smell that makes people avoid eye contact on the street and whisper behind cupped hands at the local diner. Animal control was dispatched first, expecting raccoons or a possum that had met its end in the crawlspace. What they found instead was a man, emaciated, trembling, wrapped in moth-eaten blankets on a soiled mattress in the corner of what had once been a dining room. He hadn't spoken in years, according to the sparse medical records they could locate. He had no identification, no family listed, no social security number that matched any living person in the federal database. He was simply John Doe of Vernon Township, a ghost with a pulse, a riddle wrapped in yellowed skin and silence. Elena arrived as the paramedics were loading him into the ambulance, and she would never forget the way his eyes locked onto hers through the grimy window of the emergency vehicle. They were the eyes of someone who had stopped expecting rescue long ago. They were the eyes of a man who had made peace with being invisible. And in that single, fleeting moment of contact, something shifted in Elena's chest, a crack in the armor she had spent her entire career building. She didn't know it then, but the Vernon Dae had just begun his gruesome work on her. The investigation went nowhere for 3 months. Dental records yielded nothing. Fingerprint databases came back empty. The FBI's Missing Persons Unit sent a curt email suggesting she focus on active cases with prosecutorial potential. Her captain, a pragmatic man named O'Malley who had long ago traded his idealism for indigestion, pulled her aside one afternoon and said the words every detective dreads, "Let it go, Marchetti. Some people don't want to be found." But Elena couldn't let it go. There was something about the way he had gripped her hand during the ambulance ride, his bony fingers wrapping around hers with a desperate, wordless eloquence. She had visited him twice a week at the county hospital, sitting beside his bed and filling the silence with stories about her daughter's soccer games, the stray cat that had taken up residence on her porch, the frustrating crossword puzzle she couldn't finish. He never responded. He never even blinked in acknowledgement. But his hand, resting on the thin hospital blanket, would occasionally twitch in her direction. That was enough. The unexpected turn came on a rain-soaked Thursday in October. Elena was going through a box of evidence from the farmhouse, moldy photographs, a rusted watch, a child's drawing so faded she had almost thrown it away. She held the drawing up to the light, squinting at the waxy crayon lines, and felt her heart stop. It depicted 2 stick figures holding hands beneath a yellow sun. One was labeled Daddy. The other was labeled Lily. And in the corner, in careful, childish handwriting, was a last name that had never appeared in any database Elena had searched. She found Lily within 48 hours. Lily was 63 years old now, living in a modest duplex in Portland, Oregon, where she worked as a school librarian and volunteered at a food bank on weekends. She had spent 35 years believing her father was dead. When Elena called, there was a long silence on the other end of the line, followed by a sound she would never forget, not quite a sob, not quite a laugh, but something raw and primal that seemed to come from a place deeper than grief. The story poured out of Lily in fragments, like pieces of a broken vase finally being gathered after decades of sweeping them under the rug. Her father, Walter Brennan, had been a truck driver in the 1980s, a gentle giant with calloused hands and a laugh that filled up entire rooms. He had loved his daughter with a fierceness that bordered on the religious, driving 12 hours round trip every other weekend to see her after the divorce. Then came the accident, not a crash, but something far more insidious. A traumatic brain injury from a falling load at the warehouse. The man who emerged from the hospital was not the same man who had entered it. He had lost the ability to speak, to recognize faces, to remember that he had a daughter who was waiting for him at a rest stop with a handmade sign that said, "Welcome home, Daddy." The system failed him in the usual ways. His ex-wife remarried and moved away. His medical records were lost in a fire. He wandered from one institution to another, each one releasing him into the streets when funding ran dry, each discharge notice erasing another piece of his identity. By the time he found his way to the Vernon farmhouse, abandoned, forgotten, a perfect hiding place for someone who had already disappeared from the world, he had become what the case file called a persistent vegetative state. But Elena had seen his hand twitch. She had seen his eyes follow her across the room. Somewhere inside that broken vessel, Walter Brennan was still fighting to come home. The emotional climax did not happen in a courtroom or a hospital room. It happened on a grey November morning at the edge of a frozen pond in Vernon Township, and it involved no detectives, no lawyers, no cameras. Elena had arranged for Lily to visit her father at the long-term care facility where he had been transferred, a clean, compassionate place run by nuns who specialized in patients the world had abandoned. Lily arrived with a suitcase full of photographs and a heart full of terror. She had not seen her father in 35 years. She had attended a funeral for a man who was not actually dead. She had mourned him, buried him, moved on, and now here he was, resurrected by a stubborn detective who refused to accept that some people don't want to be found. Elena waited in the hallway, giving them privacy, but she could hear everything through the thin hospital door. At first, there was nothing but silence. Then came Lily's voice, cracking like ice in spring. "Daddy? It's me. It's Lily. I brought your favorite. Remember those oatmeal cookies you used to eat by the dozen?" More silence. Elena pressed her forehead against the cool wall and closed her eyes, preparing herself for disappointment, for the cruel reality that Walter might not recognize his own daughter, that his brain injury had stolen more than just his voice. Then she heard it. A sound so soft she almost missed it, a sound that made her knees buckle and her eyes fill with tears. It was the sound of Walter Brennan humming. Not words, he had lost those decades ago. But a tune. A simple, halting melody that rose and fell like a lullaby. Lily gasped, then began to cry, and through her sobs she whispered, "You remember. Oh, Daddy, you remember. That's the song you used to sing to me before bed. You are my sunshine. You remember." The nuns came out of their offices, drawn by the commotion. A young nurse named Maria stopped in the middle of her rounds, her hand flying to her mouth. Even Captain O'Malley, who had shown up unannounced to check on Elena's pet project, found himself standing frozen in the doorway, his cynical mask crumbling like dry clay. Walter Brennan could not speak. He could not feed himself or recognize his own reflection. But somewhere deep in the tangled wreckage of his brain, in a corner that the accident had not destroyed, a father's love for his daughter had survived 3 decades of silence, solitude, and erasure. That love was humming through the room like a prayer, like a promise, like a miracle dressed in oatmeal cookies and old photographs. Elena stepped into the room just as Lily climbed onto the hospital bed beside her father, wrapping her arms around his frail shoulders. Walter's eyes were closed, but his weathered face had softened into something that looked almost like peace. His hand, the same hand that had gripped Elena's in the ambulance, found his daughter's hair and stroked it with a tenderness that defied every medical diagnosis, every professional opinion, every rational explanation. The gruesome case of the Vernon Dae had not been solved by forensic evidence or legal procedure. It had been solved by a stubborn detective who refused to believe that a man could be reduced to a case number, and a daughter who never stopped loving a father the world had declared dead. The weeks that followed were not easy. Walter passed away 6 months later, peacefully, with Lily holding his hand and humming their song. But something had changed in Vernon Township, something that rippled outward like stones dropped into still water. The nuns at the care facility started a program called the Dae Project, dedicated to identifying and reuniting long-term patients with their families. Captain O'Malley, of all people, spearheaded a department-wide initiative to review cold missing persons cases. Maria, the young nurse, went back to school to become a patient advocate, determined to ensure that no one else fell through the cracks the way Walter had. And Elena Marchetti, the hardened detective who had seen too much and believed too little, found herself looking at the world differently. She started calling her estranged brother. She started bringing homemade lasagna to the elderly neighbor who never had visitors. She started, for the first time in years, allowing herself to hope. The last time Elena saw Lily was at a small ceremony in the Vernon town square, where a bench had been dedicated to Walter's memory. The bench was simple, unadorned, with a bronze plaque that read, "No one is ever truly lost as long as someone remembers." Lily hugged Elena for a long time, and then she pulled back and looked her in the eyes with the same fierce love that had carried her through 35 years of wrongful grief. "You want to know what I think?" Lily said, her voice steady and sure. "I think my father's greatest gift wasn't surviving all those years alone. It was showing us that every person has a song inside them, even the ones who can no longer sing it. Especially the ones who can no longer sing it. We just have to be quiet enough to listen." Elena nodded, thinking of all the case files she had closed over the years, all the John and Jane Does she had categorized and filed away, all the names she had never bothered to learn. She thought of Walter's hand twitching toward her in that sterile hospital room, reaching across the vast chasm of his broken mind to say something his lips could not form. "I am here. I was always here. Please don't stop looking for me." The story of the Vernon Dae spread further than anyone expected. It was picked up by a local journalist, then a national one, then shared across social media by people who had never heard of Vernon Township but understood, instinctively, that Walter's story was also their story. Because every community has its forgotten ones, the elderly man in the nursing home who never gets visitors, the homeless woman on the corner whose name no one bothered to learn, the quiet neighbor whose absence goes unnoticed until the mail piles up. Every city has its John and Jane Does, not just the ones in morgues and hospitals, but the ones walking among us, invisible and unheard, waiting for someone to stop and see them. The heartwarming and uplifting message of the Vernon Dae is not that miracles happen, though perhaps they do, in their quiet, undramatic way. It is that each of us holds the power to be someone's miracle. It is that a single act of attention, of persistence, of stubborn, irrational hope can pull a person back from the brink of oblivion. It is that love is not diminished by silence or erased by time or defeated by tragedy. Love, as Walter Brennan proved from his soiled mattress in that crumbling farmhouse, is the one thing that survives even when everything else is lost. So the next time you pass someone on the street, the man talking to himself on the subway platform, the woman sitting alone in the park, the child eating lunch by themselves in the school cafeteria, remember the Vernon Dae. Remember that every person has a story, and every story matters, and no one is ever truly beyond the reach of compassion. You don't need to solve a gruesome case or launch a nationwide investigation. You just need to look. You just need to listen. You just need to hum the melody, however faint, and trust that somewhere in the silence, someone is humming it back. Elena Marchetti retired from the police force 5 years later, but she never stopped thinking about Walter. She kept his photograph on her nightstand, right next to the one of her daughter's wedding. On difficult days, she would look at his face, the face of a man the world had tried to erase, and remind herself of what she had learned in that crumbling farmhouse on Old Mill Road. The gruesome case of the Vernon Dae was never really about death or decay or the darkness that lurks in abandoned places. It was about the light that refuses to go out, even when every window is boarded up and every door is locked. It was about the song that keeps playing, even when no one is left to hear it. And it was about the power of one person, just one, to walk into the darkness and say, "I see you. You matter. You always did." That is the legacy of the Vernon Dae. Not a solved mystery or a closed case file, but an open invitation to every person who reads this story, in every corner of the world, to become the kind of person who refuses to look away. Because somewhere out there, right now, someone is waiting to be remembered. Someone is humming a song that no one else can hear. And all they need, all any of us ever really need, is for someone to stop and listen.